Hello, my name is Emmanuel Mamatzakis. I'm here to give you a professorial lecture. So today professorial lecture is going to be about the Greek sovereign debt crisis. The title of the professorial lecture is The Eternal Battle Between New and Old, and what frogs have to say. For those of you that do not see an immediate connection between sovereign debt crisis and what the frogs have to say, I'll give you a clue why I opt for this title. So this is the Epidavros Theater. It's in Peloponnesus this August. This is my daughter. So we came early to the theater. It was already going late in the evening, but still day. And we were going to watch The Frogs. It's an ancient play by Aristophanes. The Frogs is all about the battle between the new and old. This is how the theater looks after half an hour. It was fully packed. So the first thing I'm going to discuss before going through the play is the numbers of the fiscal debt crisis of Greece. So a warning in the beginning. Once Benjamin Disraeli said that there are three kinds of lies: lies, dumb lies, and statistics. So I have to warn you that you have to be careful the way that you will interpret the statistics I'm going to show. I'm afraid the whole professorial lecture will be about statistics. So bear in mind what Disraeli said some years ago, that it might be true that statistics are lying at times. So what is the fiscal crisis about? What is the Greek fiscal crisis about? So this is the government debt as percent of GDP in 2012. And we see in the red column, right in the left-hand side, Greece as percentage of GDP has 164 government debt. In 2014, the official provisional, though, measure of this government debt figure is now 177%. So it's the highest among the OECD countries, it's the highest among the European countries, among the euro area countries. So just to give you an indication of other countries that they have huge debt, and they have been under strong conditionality, they have been under a strong program from European Union and IMF. Ireland, 126% of GDP. United Kingdom, just to compare with, 101% of GDP. And then we have Netherlands of 83% of GDP. I show Netherlands because you will understand later on why I'm doing that. Now, this is the household debt as percent of GDP. So this is what the households in every single country in our sample own. So you will see now that before Netherlands had one of the lowest debt to GDP ratio when it comes to the government debt. When it comes to the household debt, Netherlands has the highest in the OECD countries, the highest in the euro area. So the Netherlands, as percent of GDP in 2012, the household debt of net, as percent of net disposable income, is 311%. Ireland is 230%, United Kingdom is 151%, and Greece is 110%. If we compare and we accumulate these two figures, so here we have the total debt as percent of GDP in 2013, we see that in Ireland, the total debt that's private and public, so the government debt is 123%, the private debt is 296%, it's almost 300%, it's well and above the 350%, 450% threshold. The next with the highest total debt in the euro area is Portugal, followed by Netherlands, and then is Greece, and then is UK. So when you consider the total debt of the economy, that's private and public together, you will have a different picture. So it's not Greece anymore, the ones that has the highest debt in the euro area. Ireland comes first, and Portugal, and Netherlands follow. So what is going on? Why is this the case? Here we have the household financial assets for some selected euro area member states, the ones that we were discussing previously. So you will see that the household finance as percent of total financial assets increases 73.3%, close to 74%. So it looks like households in Greece are not particularly without financial assets. So one would imagine that households in Greece, they accumulate a lot of financial assets. They are not poor, in other words. In Spain, the comparable figure is 48.1%. In Ireland is 39.6%. In UK is 28.7%. So almost a third of the household financial assets of UK compared to the Greek household financial assets. So why then there is this huge government debt? You have from one side quite a lot of financial assets accumulated by households, but then you have a lot of financial liabilities, a lot of debt, a lot of deficit that is accumulated over the years in terms of the government. So the reality is that Greece for many years ran fiscal deficit. So here we have the fiscal deficit of the blue line is the Greek fiscal deficit, the red line is the Irish fiscal deficit. And you will see that in the case of Greece in 2010, the fiscal deficit reached almost above 15% as percent of GDP. For Ireland, it reached the 30% because of the bail out of the Irish banks by the Irish government, but then it bounced back again. We see that in the Greek case, it took longer to correct. Nevertheless, it's worth mentioning here that there was a huge fiscal consolidation effort. So we see that there is a huge deficit in 2009, 2010, and there is a huge correction both for Ireland and Greece. But this huge deficit over many years accumulate a huge debt. So this is why we have in Greece a lot of government debt. But if you compare it with the debt of the household, it's not as high as countries like Ireland, Netherlands. To go through some of the causes, we are not going to discuss all the causes here of this high government debt, but to give you an idea of when all started, I will give you the chronology of some of the events. So in early days of the euro, so the euro launched in 2001, the risk premium on the Eurozone government were narrowed. So we had the convergence of the euro area risk premium. So there was also low volatility. The markets back then thought that the probability of default for any euro area member state was almost virtually zero. So early on in the euro area, we had very low spreads, very low volatility. That's lasted up till the financial crisis of 2010. This is the over-the-counter derivatives market. This is the global over-the-counter derivatives market. And I'm showing you this diagram because I want to explain you some of the forces that they are underlying this financial crisis in 2010. So the dark black line here is the official sector, is the market as it is traded in the exchange all around the world. And then you have these bars showing you what is over the counter. So it's not formally within an exchange trading floor like the New York Stock Exchange or like the London Stock Exchange, but these are deals that they are performed, they are done through the phone. So you will see that over the years, over 2 decades, we have an exponential growth of over-the-counter deals. So you will come in 2009, you will see that the total accumulation of over-the-counter derivatives markets, and is measured in trillions United States dollars, is 600 trillion. $600 trillion. And it's a market that is basically hard to get grasp of because they are not part of an official exchange trading floor. It's not like this dark line here that we have information and we have data. So the formal, let's say, sector, the one that is traded in the exchange floor, is less than 100 trillion compared with what is traded over the counter, over a phone line, for example. So over these 2 decades, we've seen an exponential growth of over-the-counter derivatives counter, and we've seen a mild growth of the exchange traded. The powers involved in these markets are enormous, especially if you consider the over-the-counter derivatives markets. So at the same time that this was happening, a huge market was developing. It was very difficult to understand. It was very difficult to study because the data there are not publicly released. They are very hard to get. What was going on with Greece? So in Greece, we had an accumulation of deficit over many years since the early 80s. And this over many years resulted to a high government debt as percent of GDP. But in 2009 in particular, in the end of 2009, the government deficit as percent of GDP was 9.1% of GDP. So for that year, the target was supposed to be not more than 3, 4, at maximum 5% of GDP. So by the end of 2009, it skyrocketed to 9%. And then over some statistical revisions, this figure also was again revised to go beyond that 9% and go beyond the 10% threshold and reach measures of around 14%. So it was a high deficit. As a result of this, Greece found itself in a very difficult situation to finance its financial needs for the budget in 2010. Over a very short time period, over let's say 3 to 4 months in 2010, find it difficult to borrow money anymore from the markets because the spreads, and together with the spreads, as we'll see later, the CDS was skyrocketed. So just to give you a perception here of what we are talking about, in April 2010, the 2-year bond spread was 652 basis points. So if Greeks had to borrow money from the market in April 2010, he had to pay 652 basis points above the benchmark. In most of the cases, is the Bund in order to borrow money. By April 2010, the 2-year bond spread reached the point of 1,552 basis points. So more than double in a period of less than 3 weeks. So in April 2010, the Greek government started negotiating with partners within the euro area, but also with IMF for a rescue package to borrow basically money from what we call these days institutions, what it was called back then Troika, EU, ECB, and IMF. If you want to have a diagram of what I just explained you, so the blue line is the spreads of the Greek government bonds. So you will see that there was a peak in spring 2010, just before the package was fixed. And then we had a drop, but overall we have a positive upward trend for the Greek government bonds. Similarly, it was for other member states like Portugal and Ireland. And then we have Spain and Italy in the backdrop here that they fluctuate with a slightly upward trend. So there was a huge crisis in the euro area member states. Greece, but not only Greece, also other member states like Ireland and Portugal find it extremely difficult to finance their budget, find it extremely difficult to basically pay pensions, pay salaries, and pay their debt obligations. Around that time, we've seen the creation or the generation of a new market, the CDS market. So what is the CDS? The CDS is the abbreviation of credit default swaps. So it's an insurance premium that you pay in case the underlying bond you hold in your portfolio is going to default. So if I buy a Greek bond, and I think that in some point Greece is going to default, in order to be safe and not lose my capital, I buy also a credit default swap. And then I'm secure against the probability that the Greek bond is going to default. So the CDS basically gives you a forward looking of what is going to happen with the market, because it's the insurance you have to pay against the probability of one of the bonds you hold, one of the government bonds here, are going to default. So the blue line is again Greece, the red line is Portugal, and the light blue line is Ireland. So we see that over a very short period, from end of 2009 till 2011, that the sample here stops, we have a skyrocketing exponential growth in the CDS for these member states of the euro area that join the financial assistance mechanism, that join the conditionality imposed by Troika. Something that you have to notice also, and I want to emphasize, is look at the early of the sample here. So if you go all the way back in the early days of 2009, you will see that the CDS was very low and fluctuated close to the zero. You have to remember now, going back, the huge amount of money that they are investing over the counter to the derivatives market. Note that the CDS is over the counter in the derivatives market. So it's part of this $600 trillion market. So before the crisis of the euro area, there was virtually basically no market there because the CDS were extremely low. So not long time ago, not going back to 2001, if you go early in 2009, you will notice that there was not a lot of CDS volatility. There was not a lot of CDS energy. So since the Greek kind of crisis, we have an exponential growth of these CDS sovereign debt bonds. So if anything, Greece contributed to this financial crisis by giving life to a whole new market, CDS for sovereign bonds of the euro area. One strand of the research is taking advantage of this data, spread, and CDS to come up with revealing the preference, revealing market expectations about the crisis. So to give you a short introduction of a research that I'm currently going through is this relationship between the CDS and the spreads of Greek government bonds, but also for other euro area member states that they are under strong conditionality or they have been within a program, within a rescue program. No arbitrage will imply that the price of the CDS equals the government bond yield, the government spread. So if there is no arbitrage opportunities out there, then the CDS you pay and the spread for the bond you hold in your portfolio should be very similar. There should not be misalignment in these two spreads. On the contrary, when there are misalignments, when the basis becomes negative or the basis becomes positive, then there are investment strategies that they are involved and they are emerged. So for example, if the basis becomes negative, then you have a strategy to implement. So what you are trying to do when the basis is negative? Basically, in that case, government bonds are more expensive than CDS. What does that mean? It means that the bond spreads are lower than the CDS. So you can profit out of this misalignment by implementing what we call a negative basis trade. So you could short sell the bond and write a CDS protection. It's difficult, although, to do this in practice, as it proved out, because if it is a period with high negative basis, it's very costly to obtain the bond via repo transaction in order to short sell it. Also, if the repo rates are very low, that implies that highly rated bonds are difficult to obtain in order to short sell. Then there is a high cost for protection writers to hedge their positions. But in principle, you could go ahead with a negative basis trade, and there is profit there to be made. So equally for the positive basis. So the point of the research I'm conducting right now is to take information out of the spreads and the CDS for the Greek bonds, but also for the Irish bonds, the Spanish bond, the Italian bonds, and the Portuguese bonds, and try to see whether these strategies, whether the negative or the positive basis strategies, can reveal some of the preference, some of the expectations of the markets about the prospects of these economies in the medium to the short term. So how I will do that? I fit a generalized loss function, and bear with me with these numbers. I'm going to go through, not in a lot of detail, but I'm going to through shortly with some mathematical and algebraic forms here, but it's just for the exposition of the idea. So I fit a loss function on this basis. Basically, if you are a trader in the city, you try to exploit all arbitrage opportunities. You try to exploit the misalignment between the spread and the CDS. If you don't exploit it, somebody else, another trader, will exploit it. So in this respect, you have to quickly make an assessment of the market, to quickly read the basis, the difference between the spread and the CDS, and make a strategy, implement a trade. If you are not quick enough, or if the basis you observe is not the one that is actually in place, then you have a loss. And this is where it comes, the loss function. What is this loss? You missed the arbitrage opportunities that they are out there. So you may consider that there is no difference between the spread and CDS, when indeed there is a difference between the spread and the CDS. So you don't take advantage of the arbitrage opportunities, somebody else will take advantage. So based on this notion, I fit a loss function. The loss function looks like this. So we have the loss function depending on spread and the CDS. It's a flexible loss function, so it can be linear or non-linear, and the non-linearity or the linearity is captured by the coefficient rho, which, as you will see here, is the power of the function. And if it takes the value of 1, it's a linear function. If it takes the value of 2, it's a non-linear function. The most important parameter that we try to estimate here is actually alpha. So alpha, what it gives us is not the actual loss of the trader. It gives us the preference of the trader. It gives us the symmetry or the asymmetry of the loss function. Be careful that in principle, the trader is indifferent whether it's a positive or a negative basis, whether the spread is higher than the CDS or the CDS is higher than the spread. So it's completely symmetric. This is basically on the rational expectation hypothesis, where the trader will be able to perform a negative basis trade or a positive trade, giving the same weight in both the trades. So if alpha is 0.5, we have the symmetry. So we have someone that is playing in the market and has no preference over negative or a positive basis. On average, this is what we expect to find. The interesting result will be when alpha takes value away from symmetry. Could be higher than 0.5, could be lower than 0.5. So I went through some of the data that I showed you earlier for some of the euro area member states, and I estimate this alpha parameter. So here we have the asymmetric loss function for the Greek bonds, the spreads, the difference between the spreads and the CDS on weekly frequencies in the linear case from end of 2008 till 2010. And we find out that early on, the alpha takes values below 0.5, early on in the sample, before the crisis, before the conditionality, before the Troika program. But since the Troika program, since spring 2010, alpha in the case of Greece takes values of 0.77 whatever is the instrument that we are using. So if you want to have a view of how the loss function looks like, so this is the loss function. The red dotted line is based on the estimations we find earlier, based on the estimations that I just showed you. So if alpha is 0.77, there is a higher loss attached on the positive basis. So there is a higher loss when the spread is higher than the CDS. So what the markets prefer in the case of the Greek sovereign bonds is to have the CDS higher than the spread. Why is that? Because their loss in the case of a negative basis is lower than their loss in the case of positive basis. In other words, what I tried to explain you here is that if you look at the data, and despite this conditionality, this strong conditionality, these financial assistance programs over many years now, because the first financial assistance program started in spring 2010. In spring 2012, there was the second program, and now we are in the merge of perhaps another yet financial assistance program for Greece. Markets are very pessimistic. They clearly prefer, when it comes to the Greek government bonds, negative basis. So they take stand, the markets take stand in the Greek case, and they consider as quite pessimistic the prospect of the financial needs and the financial borrowing of Greece. And why is that? Because they always prefer the CDS to be higher than the spread. They always prefer that there is a higher probability of default in the case of Greece, compared with a lower probability of default. So what is going on here? There's clearly a difference with other member states of the Eurozone. So for example, in Portugal, in Italy, in Spain, in Ireland, we get alphas close to symmetry. So there is a huge difference between the alphas we get for Greece compared with other Eurozone member states. So what we get for the case of Greece is we get the sense that the markets, when it comes to the Greek fiscal issues, are extreme pessimistic about the prospects, about the viability of the Greek public finances. So I will try to explain why is this so, and why the markets, with their trading kind of strategies, they are very pessimistic about the Greek prospects. Try to think that if something happens and it's not extremely positive, so it might be the case that more bad news are going to be accumulated. So just to try to interpret the Greek, say that we quote here, enous kakou miria ebodem. The equivalent in English is, it never rains, but it pours. So what I try to explain you here. Early on, in the first program, the Greek government back then agreed on a huge fiscal consolidation effort. So they agreed in having a fiscal consolidation effort within a very short period, within 1 2 year period, of a very substantial nature, over 11% of GDP. In the first assessment of the Greek government program, the EU Commission, the DG ECFIN, clearly states that the huge fiscal consolidation effort early on in the program was a source of misunderstanding with the Greek authorities back then. In other words, the Troika, the EU Commission in particular, said early on in the program that perhaps is doing too much in terms of austerity compared with what it would be ideal, what would be optimal. What was the result of this big bank approach, this huge fiscal consolidation early on? Basically, there was a stallment of the economy. Over the next 4 years, from 2010 till 2014, 2015 now, Greece lost a quarter of its GDP, so 25% of the GDP was lost, and as a result, there was a huge unemployment eruption in Greece. So the unemployment rate in Greece in Q3 of 2014 is 26.2%, compared with 0.2% in Spain, 5.9% in UK, and an average just above 5% in the OECD. So as the result of this early on big bank approach, huge fiscal effort, was an eruption of unemployment, and there was a huge loss of output. So early on, the austerity seems to stalemate the economy. As a result of this, the youth unemployment also skyrocketed. So Greece youth unemployment is almost 60%, 58.3%. In Spain, the comparable figure is 55.5%. This had a dramatic result for the Greek labor market. We have experienced in Greece a huge human capital flight. When you are a Greek young scientist and you are faced with a huge unemployment rate close to 60%, you have little options. You cannot stay anymore in a labor market that does not exist. So basically, you take away your human capital and flee to perhaps another labor market, another country. And this has huge consequences for the growth potential of the Greek economy, because the potential growth is also based on human capital, let alone population. And so we have seen a hemorrhage, a drain of human capital in Greece over this 5 years period as a result of the enormous fiscal conditionality imposed by the enormous also fiscal effort of the first years of the program. So gross domestic product, red line, Greece. So in 2013, as per capita terms, USA dollars, increase is $25,586 per capita. And that is a huge drop if you consider that only 2 years earlier, in 2009, the GDP per capita in USA dollars was well above 30K in Greece. If you compare it with other member states of the Eurozone, with other member states of European Union, you will find out that in the case of Greece, this is a dramatic drop and has no equal in the Euro area, in the European Union. Household disposable income as a result of this huge drop in per capita income. This is the annual growth rate. In 2012, the annual growth rate is minus 10.2%. This is a huge loss of disposable income when it comes to the household. So remember early on, the household increase had a huge financial asset base. But we see that over the austerity years, there is a loss of household disposable income that is basically counting off these household financial assets. Why is this so? Because the austerity imposed in Greece was based on a very simple principle. If you are in a currency zone and if your nominal exchange rate is fixed, the only way of gaining competitiveness is to go through the internal devaluation of your well-being, basically. So in other words, we have to go through austerity. You have to reduce spending, not only at the public sector, but also in the private sector, at the household level sector, so as to gain some of the competitiveness. You have to lower down, in other words, the inflation, because the inflation differential with the most competitive economy, i.e. Germany, meant that you are losing competitiveness over many years of the euro area. So it looks like these policies had as a result a huge loss of household income over the years. So as a result, poverty in Greece is really an issue these days. So in Greece, poverty is 0.152, and this is the percentage as percentage of poverty of the same age group. And if you compare it with Spain, it's very close to the Spanish, but it's much higher than in United Kingdom, 0.095. And this is the OECD, and we see that the cases worse than Greece is Chile, Turkey, and United States. So as a result of this internal devaluation, as a result of this loss of GDP, as a result of this loss of household income, we have an increase in poverty, but also we had an increase in income inequality in Greece. So if there is a complete equality is 0, if it is complete inequality is 1. So Greece is 0.335. It's very close to Spain with 0.344. So what happened over these austerity years? We have a catastrophic loss of income. As I said, a quarter of the GDP was lost over a very short period of time, over 3-4 years. Some projects, some public projects continued. And the idea was that over these austerity years, you carry on, continue with the investment of some of the public projects. And this is supposed to bring money into the battery economy. But the truth is that in Greece over these years, there was very few credit going on, whether to the private or to the public sector of the economy. So over these 3-4 years, we have a depletion of funds. The funds have been depleted. So the financial stability is so desperate, has been so desperate for some years now, that could be the case that we will end up having an emergency currency. So you have a regular currency to pay expenses, for example, our debt obligations, and then you have an emergency currency to pay the rest. So this is where we stand right now. This is where Greece, where Athens in particular, stood something like 2,500 years ago. So we are in the 413 BC. The Athenian state faced a dramatic war with Sparta for over a 30-year period. As a result of this war with Spartans, Athenians faced with a catastrophic loss of income. Some of the public building projects continue, like Erechtheum in Acropolis, and the idea was to invest on these projects to show that you have the economic prosperity to go on with this Acropolis completion, but also for bringing money into the battery economy. because this generated exchange. The war depleted, though, the funds available for non-military spending. So the financial stability was so desperate by the end of the war that the Athenians turned their silver coins. So up till the war, there was another currency, silver coins, and they exchanged them for an emergency kinds of bronze. So they exchanged the silver coins to the bronze coins. So the regular silver coins used to pay war expenses, while the bronze coins used to pay all the rest. Sounds familiar? So we are again 2,500 years later facing similar kind of situations. So we have again catastrophic loss of output, catastrophic loss of income. This time it's not because of the war, it's because of the financial crisis, it's because of the debt crisis, but nevertheless we have a catastrophic loss of income. We have some public spending, but not much. We have a depletion of capital, we have financial instability. What we haven't seen so far is the introduction of a new currency. But if you look back, and you go back 2,500 years, you will see that back then, when they faced similar situations, the only way that they had to go away from this currency depletion, funds depletion, is to introduce a new currency that's worth less. So what the frogs say then in the Aristophanes? When I went to Epidavros and I saw the play, by the way, it was an extremely good play of frogs this year in 2014 in Epidavros. What the frogs said? Well, ironically, they say that we treat the old and the trusted coin along with the new gold. Both are pure metal and are used all over Greece and by the rest of the world. But we don't use them at all. And instead, we work with these useless copper coins, which we have only just mined a day or two ago, with the worst possible stamp. That's what we do with our citizens too. So in frogs, in Aristophanes, we have a declaration, we have a strong statement that this new currency is bringing basically inequality, is bringing chaos, as the citizens are treated not as they used to be treated because of this worthless coin, the worthless currency that is introduced now after so many years of war. So where this brings me? It brings me to the fiscal data, to the public economic data, la Demosia Economica. So why we had all this loss of output, why we have this huge austerity effort to put fiscal imbalances in the Greek case into order. So this is the general government spending as percent of GDP. You find out that in Greece, when it comes to the average of the OECD, 51.8% of total GDP is general government spending. This compares with 50.1% in Netherlands, 47.9% in UK, 47.1% in Ireland, 45.9% in Spain. So there's no massive difference when it comes to the general government spending. The truth remains, though, that the Greek general government debt, the Greek general government spending as percent of GDP is well above what you observe in other Euro area member states. When it comes to the general government revenue, though, there is even much striker observation. So you have a country that has a lot of government spending. When it comes to the government revenue, there is kind of shortfall. So 51 as a general government spending, 44 as general government revenue. Netherlands, if you compare, it's 46.4%, UK 41.7%, 37.1% in Spain, 34.5% in Ireland. So there is a misalignment between the general government spending and the general government revenue. So despite being, in the Greek case, being the ones that they spend more, they are not the ones that they receive more as well. They are not the ones that they raise more tax revenues. When it comes to the central government spending, though, the situation is much different. So we see that in the central government spending, Greece has a very low percentage of public services, if you like. It's 20.4% compared with 61.8% in Ireland. So it's not the central government that creates this issue of high government spending. It's the general government. It's beyond the ministries that we face real with a huge government bill. When it comes to the pension spending, something that we are often see in the news, in Greece there is a huge spending for pension. It's partly true. We see that as percent of GDP, Greece spends 13% for pension spending, and this compares with 6.2 in United Kingdom and 5.1 in Ireland. But if you look in Italy, for example, the situation, it's way more than the Greek. So you see that it's above 14% in the case of Italy. France and Austria, all of them have higher spending for pensions compared to Greece. Nevertheless, given that Greece now is facing a huge government debt, pension spending is an issue and something that Troika often brings into the discussions of conditionality. Tax revenue. So we explain a little bit the spending, we explain a little bit the aggregate tax revenues. Let's see now a few more details on the tax revenues. So here we have the total in USA dollars per capita tax revenue from 2000 to 2013. So you will see that there was a positive trend in the Greek case up till 2009, and then we have a drop. We have a negative trend thereafter. So since the financial crisis, since the sovereign debt crisis, in Greece, we have a reduction in the tax revenue per capita. So this crisis, this austerity that brought a recession to the economy also affected the tax revenues. If you compare it with Germany and United Kingdom, these two lines, you will see that it's a huge difference. So there is also a divergence that is emerging. So if you see UK and Germany, you obviously observe a positive trend since 2009, since 2010, coming to this day. If you look at the Greek case, you have a negative trend all along. So this austerity didn't improve tax revenue per capita over the years. One of the reasons is the huge recession. Corporate profits. What happens when we consider corporate profits? So overall, we see that in the case of Germany, there is a kind of stability of corporate taxation at 5% over the years since the crisis. In UK, we have a slightly decline, a slightly negative trend, but in the case of Greece, we have a huge drop of corporate profits, of taxation on corporate profits. Sorry. So we observe that there is a shortfall in tax revenues per capita overall since 2010, since conditionality was imposed. But most importantly, we see that taxation on corporate profits massively declined over these years. What about taxation on personal income? So this is taxation on public employees, on private employees in Greece. We'll see that as percent of taxation since the austerity, since 2010, we have an exponential positive growth when it comes to personal income taxation increase. So as percent of taxation increase in 2012 is 20.61%. Recent figures put this number close to 24% for 2014, but these are not validated as yet. If you compare it with Germany, it's 26.4%. If you compare it with UK, it's 27.8%. It starts from a very low levels. It starts in 2000, it was 14%. It dropped in 2010 to this 14%, but then we have a skyrocketing of tax on personal income. So what's going on? Since the austerity, since this Greek fiscal drama, since we have the unfold of the Greek sovereign debt crisis, there was a desperate effort to increase taxation. There was a desperate effort to increase direct taxation, personal income taxation, as we saw in the previous diagram. There was also a huge effort, a desperate effort to increase taxation on goods and services. That is, let's say, the indirect taxation. So as percent of GDP in 2013 is almost 40% of total taxation comes from indirect taxation. If you compare it with the United Kingdom, it's 33%. If you compare it with Germany, it's 27.9%. So we have, again, a kind of divergence when it comes to the basically taxation fundamental. The peculiarity with the Greek tax system is that if you interpret these figures, what you come out is that the direct taxation increase, it's close to 1/3 of the total taxation. So the rest of the tax base, if you like, comes from indirect taxation. And this is kind of anomaly if you look at other OECD countries, because in other OECD countries, it's the other way around. So in UK, in Germany, 1/3 comes from indirect taxation, let's say taxation on goods and services, and 2/3 comes from direct taxation, like corporate taxation or personal income taxation. So what does that mean? It means that there is a fundamental issue with the Greek tax system. The base of taxation is not exactly smooth. It's not exactly what we would call a main and mainstream taxation base, as you see in other developed economies. There are a lot of distortions. And based on these distortions, based on these anomalies, the Greek tax system ends up receiving much less from direct taxation compared with indirect taxation. Some they may say that the issue in Greece is not that people, they don't have to pay taxes, it's that they will not pay the taxes, especially when it comes to direct taxation. It's notoriously the way that in Greece you have medical doctors, you have lawyers that openly, when you discuss with them, are telling you that they didn't pay their taxations. It's very difficult, and it proves to be extremely difficult to tax these people, compared, let's say, with public servants, that they declare their taxable income. When it comes to property taxation, another thing that happened over the austerity years in Greece is that we have a huge increase in property taxation in Greece. So we see this figure now, you see this trend as percent of GDP is 2%. When it comes to UK, it's 4%. When it comes to Germany, it's 0.9%. So observe that the Greek property taxation started from a very low point, and over the crisis, it rise to above 2%. There is a lump sum property taxation increase that is still going on today, and is supposed to raise revenues needed to pay back debtors. So what's the issue with the taxation? As I said, some believe that the tax problem in Greece is not that people cannot pay their taxes, let's say lawyers or medical doctors, is that they will not pay their taxes. Here we have from OECD a study that they did in 2009. In the case of Greece, we see the main pathogenes, the main difficulties of raising taxes. So the VAT gap in Greece in 2006 is 30. And that compares to a EU 25 average of 12. So what is this VAT gap? This is still a big concern for the Greek government. You have companies, you have self-employed that they receive VAT, but then they don't go and pay to the government. And it is an enormous VAT gap if you compare it with other EU member states. The shadow economy, 25.1%, and this is percentage values of GDP increase compared with 13.34, the OECD average. The tax debt to annual net revenue, Greece 37.9%, OECD average 8.5%. This is a huge figure. So people, they don't commit themselves to pay their taxes. This creates tax arrears, and then it's very difficult to collect as time is passing by. Number of verifications to tax papers increased 0.2 compared with the OECD average of 4.1. So what does that mean? It means that the tax authorities may know that there is an accumulation of tax debt, yet because of human capital constraints, because of technical constraints, because of other political kind of constraints, they don't verify these taxes to the taxpayers if you compare with the OECD average. So there is a huge kind of issue that the tax system has to address. It has to convince people that it's their duty to pay taxes. So we've seen the spending side, we've seen the tax revenue side. Let's see now what we call the primary balance, το πρωτογενές πλεόνασμα. So what is the primary balance? Once you pay for everything, and what it comes out if you exclude the interest expenses for your debt is considered as the primary balance. As a Secretary General in the General Accounting Office, I pay very close attention to this general government primary balance because basically it gives you an idea how well you can fund your budget. So we compare here a few figures. We have Greece, Norway, and some other OECD countries. So you will see that the general government primary balance in the case of Greece went from minus 2.4% of GDP to 1.5% of GDP in 2014. Now, pay attention here, the 1.5% of GDP for 2014 has been now revised and is down to 0.3% in 2014. There are many reasons for this revision. I'm not going to go through, but the basic idea is that we undershoot the target of 1.5. For 2015, 2016, there are very ambitious targets for primary balance. The primary balance is important because then it's helping you out to reduce the government debt. So this is a critical fiscal measures. Based on this, then you will have to look at the viability of your government debt. If you compare with other countries, you will find out that in Norway, for example, they have an impressive primary balance of 9% in 2014, 8.1% in 2015. When it comes to Italy, you have also high figures for primary balance. When it comes to Singapore as well. So overall, because some people, they question whether you can achieve these primary balance targets, there are other countries that show that you could have a strong performance when it comes to primary balance. So why you need this primary balance? You need this primary balance to finance the budget. Remember, primary balance, it's a figure, it's what is left once you pay for interest expenses. So when it comes to the budget now, what are the important lines you have to have into the account? So you have total state revenue, total expenditures, and then you have what it follows, which is basically what you have as a central government, and then you start building up the general government. So you have the hospital, you have the employment funds, you have the health funds, you have the pension funds, you have the local governments, you have the state-owned enterprise, you have ACAGE and the EBFs, and then it accumulates to a figure which is the total general government primary balance. And based on some preliminary estimation, was estimated to be 1.8%. If you are looking at the medium-term projections for 2014, as we said, is now 0.3, has been validated, and it has been projected for 2.2% for 2015. So there are some revisions that they go their own way. They show that there is not a lot of fiscal effort towards the end of 2014, towards early 2015. But the point I would like to make here is that there are so many lines when you look at the budget. The general government is way too big now. So you have to care as a government for the employment fund, for the health funds, for pensions, for local government, for state-owned enterprises, for hospitals, for a lot of different lines. So if you want to describe this budget, here we have Hercules on the left. You could describe it as Lernaea Hydra. Every time you try to correct in the budget one situation, every time you try to cut one of the head of the Lernaea Hydra, there is one new jumping on. It's very difficult to control all this spending to raise the needed revenue for this general account, general government budget. Partly is because of the complexity, and this is the idea with the Lernaea Hydra. It's very difficult to control it because once you think that one is over, when you have the expiration of one program, then a new one starts. So if you don't have exactly control of the different lines of the budget, unavoidably you end up having issues with your debt, το χρέος. So what is the Greek debt? The total debt, based on the estimations in February 2015, is 321, let's say 322 billion euros. So you own, as a government, in treasury bills, in private sector involvement bonds, in ANFA, in new bonds with private banks, in holdouts, in securitization, in loans with ECB, in loans with other central banks, in loans with the EFSF, the ESM now. The floating interest rate for this debt as percent of total debt is 72%, and bear this information in mind, the official sector debt of the total debt is 76%. So this 76% means that something like 3/4, a little bit above 3/4 of the total debt is now with the official sector. The official sector is ECB, EU Commission, or IMF, and that's the important information to hold in your mind. If you look at the amortization of this huge debt, you'll realize that in 2015, in particular, there is a huge amortization to pay towards this debt. It's above 20%. I'm sorry, above 20 billion euros. So you have to pay DLF loans, EIB loans, IMF loans, holdouts, EFSF loans, Alpha D bills, and Bank of Greece loans, and all comes out to 20 billion euro. If you take away 2015, so you will see then that the next time you will have to pay a huge bill towards your debt, it will be 2019. So the 2016, it's a bit above 7 billion. 2017, it's a bit above 9 billion. 2018, it drops below 5 billion. So what this amortization diagram shows you that 2015, it's a very important year because it's the year you have to pay a lot as a government. So once 2015 is over, it's smoothing out your debt. And it's not by coincidence that in 2015 there are new negotiations. There are new discussions now about a new program, perhaps imposing additional conditionality, additional austerity measures. Financing needs in billions of euros. So what I was trying to say earlier with this diagram is explained here line by line. So the important bit, the one you have to have in mind is that in 2015, the financing needs, they accumulate in the end to 3.1% when it comes to interest expenditures as percent of GDP. If it comes to billion of euros, to 5.7 billions. To maturing bonds, you have to pay 7 billions. To maturing repos, you have to pay 8 billions. That's before the extension of the repos threshold. IMF repayment 8.5 billion. Outstanding bills close to 15 billions. ESM EIB contribution is 0.1. So the net financing needs for 2015, if you manage to raise these financing sources, so you get the disbursement from IMF 10 billion, you get the disbursement for EFSF 4.2 billion, will become zero. If you don't get any of these lines, then you have here negative figure. So you will have to spend much more than you raise. This is the review that was carried over by IMF in summer 2014. So they estimate back in summer 2014 that the financing gap, the financing needs, the extra financing needs that you may need as an economy is 12.6. That was projection. So the financing gap you see here is 12.6 billion euros. So back in December 2014, the IMF in its annual review came up with this financial gap. This financing gap, this is very important because this is the pressure that the current Greek government faces to agree new terms, to agree a new package for Greek financial assistance. As the Secretary General of Fiscal Policies in General Accounting Office, almost every day I look at this table. This is what we call the cash flow, how much money you have every day as a government in the Bank of Greece, the bank of the government. So it's really important to pay attention, and it's really important to look at red numbers. Whenever you see a red number, it means that you have less than required to pay pensions, to pay salaries, to pay debt obligations. So the last 2 months, this comes from the time that I used to be in office early in the year, but the last few months, I would imagine that this cash flow table is very important because the current crisis is developing into a liquidity crisis for the Greek economy. Simply, they don't have the cash. The government does not have the cash needed to pay debt obligations, but also pay pensions, salaries, the general government spending that I've seen early on with the other tables. So if you have a financing gap, if you have financing needs beyond what you receive as tax revenues, as I explained earlier, unfortunately in Greece we don't raise enough tax revenues to pay for our spending, and therefore and thereby we are in need of having borrowing from other sources to pay debt obligations and pay the general accounting spending. So if you don't have enough revenues to pay, you have to go through reforms. You have to restructure your economy. You have to restructure your economy in a way that will operate at a viable mode, that will operate in a mode that you will see in the end a reduction of the general government debt. You will see strong primary balances. You will still see perhaps surplus in general accounting balances. So what are all these reforms about? This table you cannot read. In the summer 2014, I was appointed as a Secretary General, and I went through the reforms that the Greek government completed over the first two programs of austerities. The second program is still carrying on. And there is a huge amount of effort. There is a huge amount of reform effort that went through all these years. Nevertheless, the truth is that there are structural benchmarks. There are these structural benchmarks in terms of reforms are the reforms that they are in a magnitude as such that is considered to be of much more importance compared with other reforms. So in the same IMF review that we've seen early on with the financing needs, the IMF in summer 2014 came up with this structural benchmark roadmap, the structural benchmark reforms that the government had to go through. And we will see here that by end of October 2014, there should have been a VAT reform, a wage grid reform, there should be a reform of the organic budget law, there should be an reform on the institutional and legislation of personal and corporate insolvency framework, there should be a pension reform by end of November 2014. And they have to have a secondary legislation of investment licensing law. So these are very important reforms. These are major reforms. They concern the pension. The pension reform concern the labor market reform. They concern the organic budget law, the VAT reform. I don't need to explain that these are still pending to a large extent. So the new government who came in office and agreed in 20th of February 2015 to implement some of these reforms. So these reforms agenda is still carry on with the new government as well in place. So if you go back in February 2015, you will see a whole list of the reforms proposed by the new government, the new Greek government now, regarding the conditionality imposed earlier within the second program. So we see that the government agreed for VAT policy reform, agreed on review and control spending of almost every area of the government spending, agree on social security reform, agree on particular pension contribution reform, agree also in very different ways in wider kind of reforms, including public administration and corruption, including installments of arrears regimes, including banking and non-performing loans, including privatization, labor market reforms, reforms of the judicial system, product market reforms. There was also, for the first time, a mentioning of humanitarian crisis reforms. So all these are put in place to ensure that the fight against the humanitarian crisis has no kind of fiscal effect. Troika, the new name for Troika is the institution, is very sensitive on this issue. You have to take reforms, you have to take measures that have no fiscal impact. They are neutral in terms of their fiscal impact. So back in February, we have a huge reform effort proposed by the new government. So we have the first kind of input from a new government coming in office and explaining that they are also committed to reforms and they are also committed to carry on with what is needed to restructure the economy. Closing my professorial lecture. So instead of epilogue, I'm going to go back again to the frogs. So Dionysus is the god that in this play in Frogs tried to get to the downworld, tried to go to the afterlife, and he has discussion with his then assistant Xanthias. So, my precious little slave, Dionysus says, and here I am, Dionysus, son of the wine, on food and in agony, while you, Xanthias, is riding so that you will not get tired by carrying anything. And isolate this process of Xanthias. Xanthias is complaining that he's carrying, so he's responding, but I'm carrying stuff, not carrying anything. So it says this in agony because obviously he's carrying something, and Dionysus' response is very, very striking. How could you be carrying anything if you are riding something? So the idea behind the Dionysus is since Xanthia is riding, cannot be complaining about carrying anything. And this basically is what sums up what is the Greek situation. The Greek economy is riding the euro area train, is on the euro area zone, is riding a flow of very strong economies. So the idea behind Dionysus is that once you ride some, you should not complain that you carry heavy weight. If you interpret it and if you make the metaphor to the Greek case, how you could, the Greek case now, the Greek economy start complaining that they have to carry a heavy weight since they are riding something. In other words, is the penalty or is the sacrifice you have to make by riding. So Dionysus goes to the afterlife and faces Aeschylus and Euripides, the two dramatic play writers in the ancient world that they are dead. So Aeschylus and Euripides now go in battle between each other. And this is the battle between a new and old. Who is going to gain the favor of Dionysus to go back into life and try to advise Athenians what they have to do to overcome the crisis, the financial crisis that they face after many years of war. So Aeschylus says, it's a better idea not to rear a lion in a city, but if you do, you better obey his every whim. Euripides, on the other side, says, reverse our leaders. What we should do is we should have faith in the untrustworthy and distrust the faithful. We should swap sides, get rid of those we have been trusting so far and bring in those we have been rejecting. So you have two different messages coming from two very different ancient playwriters. From one, you have Aeschylus that is leaning towards the old school, and then you have Euripides that brings new kind of ideas, bring fresh ideas, trying to bring a new start, trying to boost people that they are fresh and therefore they have a better chance of dealing with the issue. So we have this battle between old and new. In the end, I have to conclude that Aeschylus won. So in the Aristophanes, Dionysus in the end opt for Aeschylus rather than Euripides. Aristophanes and therefore Dionysus opt for the old school rather than the new school. And then Pluto, the lord of the underworld, says to Aeschylus, well then, Aeschylus, farewell. Go and give the Athenians the benefit of your good advice and educate the idiots. Sure are many of them. Give this back to Cleophon and to the tax collector. Again, we have this distrust, this not pleasant motions against the tax collectors, the mimics and Nicomachus, and these two are Hemenos. So in the end, it was the old school that won. So what does this is teaching us in terms of with the current Greek situation, of the current Greek sovereign debt crisis? So what is next? If you observe what in February Valéry Giscard d'Estaing said in a formal and public statement, it's kind of frightening, because you have one of the founders of this new era of the European Union, that based on this we have now the euro. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing is quite influential also for the Greek case, because he's one of the first that rigorously support the Greek application to join the European Union in the first place. And in February 2015 makes this strong statement, says Greece has to exit, has sortir the euro, has to go away from the euro. So, in other words, we face now a dilemma in Greece. The Greece is facing a dilemma the way that the Athenians face it some centuries, some thousand years ago. What they have to do to stay in the euro area and feel the pain the way that they were feeling in the last 4 or 5 years, or to exit, as some they suggest. They face also the dilemma who they will trust, the old or the new, who they will trust to bring them forward. We saw in both cases now and then that one of the solutions to this depletion of currency, depletion of liquidity, is to introduce another currency. In the Greece case, we have the euro. There are new voices now that are coming up that perhaps there might be now the time to introduce currency in the form of I own you titles in order to pay certain expenses like salaries and pensions. There are a lot of similarities. The general idea, I think this is something that is not obviously in the first reading of Aristophanes' play, is that back then the Athenian society was so desperate for solutions, they had to look to the previous wise men to find a way forward. But I think the dilemma between old and new school is a pseudo dilemma. There was never a question mark whether the old or new will bring forward the promise that the Greek and the Athenians back then wanted in order to move forward, in order to be more optimistic, in order to turn the page. I think Aristophanes' play highlighted the stressful situation, the difficulties of times when you have no choice and you are basically locked in a situation to choose between one and another, but without real choice, in the sense that once you are in this choice, you are left with nothing. So I think in Aristophanes' wordplay is ironic in the sense that there is not a real sense of optimism. There is not a real sense of picking someone and turning the page and go ahead with it. Once you are locked in this, you are basically with very few left. And it is crucial that you understand that you are in this situation. So among all, it's crucial to understand what is coming next. But in order to face the future, you have to know exactly where you stand now. You have to face exactly how difficult is the situation. This is a poem by Antonio Machado in Spanish. So what it's basically saying is that the one that is walking has to face in some point that there might be not a walk, there might be not a road. There might be the possibility that everything changes and everything remains the same. So what I'm trying to say here is perhaps going beyond one point trying to extend the road, going beyond the state that everything changes and everything remains the same. You have to pick up the journey, and you have to go back to the famous poem. Kavafis wrote this marvelous poem about Ithaca. So the main point of Ithaca is that it's not the destination that matters. It's not the starting points. It's the marvelous journey. So in the end of the day, you have to look at Ithaca not as a destination, but as the reason of giving you the marvelous journey. So it's not a terminal point in one decision that you have to come up with. It's not about deciding whether you will go old or new. It's not about deciding whether you will go this or that way. It's about having a journey in the end of the day. So it comes always down to this journey. Ευχαριστώ σας. Thank you for your attention.